Good day. Today I will be discussing to you the first lesson for contemporary, popular, and emergent literature, which is entitled as Interpreting and Evaluating Fiction. But first, let us look for the objectives. At the end of the discussion, you will be able to explain the characteristics, types, and elements of fiction. Second, you will be able to interpret and evaluate fiction. So, our discussion about this lesson will be divided into 3 sessions. So for the first part, we will be tackling about what is literary analysis and what are the critical approaches to literature. So for the second session, we will discuss about the types of fiction, and for the last part, we will tackle about the elements of fiction. So since we are dealing with literature, let us first define what is literary analysis. So, literary analysis is an essay that gives a thorough study of an author's work. So, it is a formal paper that tasks the reader to examine the work of an author to assess what they have read. Next, literary analysis plunges into events, investigates the characters and their specific traits, researches stylistic methods to better understand the main message of what the literary work contains. So to understand the meaning of a text, the reader can look into events, characters together with their traits, or the methods of the author on how they write the literary work. So literary analysis allows you to write a formal paper in which you make an argument and then support your argument with examples from an analysis of a literary text. So in analyzing a work, working on your argument or your thesis statement is essential. So why? Because this will be the basis of the whole paper. So to support your argument or thesis statement, you need to provide examples from the literary text. It can be through an extracted lines from the characters, specific events, etc. So in short, what is the point of literary analysis? So literary analysis enables you to develop your abilities to read a text, make an argument, logically support that argument with evidence from the text, write in an organized manner which will aid in conveying your points to the reader, and communicate via the written page. So in literary analysis, you should engage with the text and then make your argument and logically support it with evidence coming from the literary text itself. So in here, it is essential to write your paper in an organized manner. So make sure that your paper is aligned with your argument or your thesis statement, and each paragraph should be intact with each other, meaning the ideas, the context of the whole paper should be related or connected to each other. The paper should be written cohesively and with brevity. So always remember that literary analysis is not just a summary of what the literary work is all about. It allows you to assess what you have read. That's why it is important to look to a text in a larger picture when analyzing, and plan how and what you want your paper look like, so that you will be able to convey or express your points to your reader. Next, what the literary analysis is not. First, it is a paper exploring the relevance of the story to your own life. A literary analysis is not always about you, meaning in writing your paper, you should not primarily focus on your life experiences or use them as your argument. As what I have said, you should not focus on personal life experiences or use them as arguments for your topic. Remember, you are not reminiscing or evaluating your experiences on the text. Rather, you are tasked to analyze the literature itself. It is not a summary of the story and class notes. As what I have said earlier, it is not just a summary. It is more than that. Literary analysis requires you to dig deeper on about the literary work, not only on its meaning but also how does it affect the society or its reader. That does it resemble some events from the past, what makes the author write the work, or how the author write it, or why does the characters seems to be like that, and many more. So we will discuss it further later. So to help you to have a larger picture in analyzing the text, we will discuss some critical approaches to literature later. But first, let us discuss what are the steps you should take in writing your literary analysis paper. First, formulate a clear thesis. So formulate your argument or your main idea for the paper clearly, because this will lead the discussion of your entire paper. Thus, your argument is your statement that you want to prove from the text. Next, formulate a few questions relevant to your thesis. So ask yourself, what are the questions that that can be relevant to your paper? What are the things you are curious about, or how will you prove it? These are some of the questions that will help you a lot when you reread the text. So the third step is reread the story or poem you want to address carefully. Underline passages which are relevant to copy to your notes. So it is essential to reread the story. You can underline some lines or more, or make some annotations. It can be helpful to answer the questions you have formulated in addressing your thesis. Next, brainstorm ideas. So from rereading the text, brainstorm ideas that can be beneficial or you can use as your argument in your paper. Fifth, re-examine your thesis. Try to re-examine your thesis. Is it feasible to discuss? Is it supportable, or is it complex enough, or is it interesting enough for the reader to read? Next, organize your examples and your ideas. Make a rough outline including examples and page numbers. So make an outline. It is essential to make your outline. It will help you to organize your ideas and examples. It can be extracted lines from the characters. So simply put, ask yourself while you are making your outline, how would I want my work look alike? Next, start to write. Then put it all in your paper and give yourself a time to start in writing your paper. So next, ask yourself, do my sentence connect, or do my paragraphs connect? So in other words, ask yourself, does my paper make sense at all? So you will be looking, you will be asking yourself if your paper is worthy to be read or worthy to be discussed, or does your argument worthy to be discussed in your paper. Next, rewrite. Give yourself a time to revise your paper. And then the 10th one is have someone else to proofread it. Let your paper be read by someone else, so they might find mistakes or errors that you are not aware of. The next, rewrite and turn in final draft. Then after you revise your paper, and then after someone else proofread it, finalize your draft and turn it in. So here are some tips for writing your literary analysis. First, write in present tense. So instead of using visited as your verb, for example, use visit. Always remember that you should write in present tense when writing your literary analysis paper. Next, use the third person, no I or you. So keep yourself out of your analysis. Next, avoid summarizing the plot. In other words, retelling the story literally. Instead, analyze the story using literary terms. So do not literally retell the story or summarize the plot. So try to analyze the text using literary terms. This will make your paper more comprehensive and formal. Next, include a clear thesis statement which addresses something meaningful about the literature, often about the theme. So in short, make your thesis statement meaningful for you and for the readers. Next tip, use literary terms to discuss your points. In other words, character, theme, setting, rhyme, point of view, etc. So it is crucial to use literary forms in discussing your paper. Analyzing these elements can assist you to have a larger perspective of what the literary work is all about, or what is its meaning in general. Next, do not confuse characters or speakers' viewpoints with authors' viewpoints. So do not confuse characters or the speakers' point of views with the author's viewpoint, so that it will not compromise the main point or argument of the entire paper, and it will lead the readers to not be confused of what the text is all about and what is your paper points out. Next, support your points with many quotations and paraphrases, but write the majority of your paper in your own words with your own ideas. So it is crucial to support your points with many quotations coming from the text or coming from the characters. So expound your points on your own words, and avoid plagiarizing other ideas or avoid copying ideas from the others. Next, cite prose, poetry, drama, critics, and any other sources used. So it is essential to cite your sources correctly. So it can be on MLA or APA format, depending on what your professor or what your professor calls for you or requires you to use as your format in citing your sources. So now, let us move on what are the critical approaches to literature. So first, let us define what is literary criticism. So according to Markland, literary criticism is the study, analysis, and evaluation of imaginative literature. Everyone who expresses an opinion about a book, a song, a play, or a movie is a critic, but not everyone's opinion is based upon thought, reflection, analysis, or consistently articulated principles. So according to Markland, literary criticism or literary analysis is the act of studying, analyzing, evaluating literature. A person doing a literary analysis or a literary criticism is called a critic. So literary criticism is not reading between the lines. Rather, it is the actual act of reading the lines very carefully in a disciplined and informed manner. So doing a critic paper is not simply giving one's opinion about a book, a song, a play, etc. It is essential to base your opinion, thoughts, or analysis in articulated principles. So from that, you will be able to read the lines very carefully and in a disciplined manner. And this is the main focus of literary criticism. So though the use of approaches to literature can help the students reveal the subtle details of the text. So through the approaches to literary criticism, it will assist the students to look at the literary text in a larger perspective. So let us now move on to the critical approaches to literature. First is the historical approach. So the following approaches that we will briefly discuss can be applied for critiquing a literature or when analyzing a literary text. So first is the historical approach. It seeks to interpret the work of literature through understanding the times and the culture in which the work was written. So this approach requires the critic's understanding on the work's times and culture, including the events, the experiences, the life of the author, to be able to interpret the text. Next, The historical critic is more interested in the meaning of the literary work had for its own time than in the meaning of the work that might have today. So the critic looks beyond the literature. They look for broader historical and cultural events that may influence the author to write the literary text. Next approach is biographical approach. So this approach investigates the life of an author using primary texts such as letters, diaries, and other documents that might reveal the experience, thought, and feelings that led to the creation of a literary work. So biographical approach, the critic using this approach examines the author's life through their primary text rather, such as letters, diaries, and the like, that might influence the author in writing the work itself. So it might be the author's experiences, values, beliefs, etc. Next approach is the formalistic approach. So the formalistic approach began with Aristotle, a philosopher of ancient Greece, who in his book The Poetics attempted to define the form of tragedy. So the main founder of formalistic approach is Aristotle. So his work emphasizes the literary work's form and structure. His work about the notions of tragedy in his book entitled The Poetics paved its way for founding the formalistic approach. The formalist critic embraces on the objective theory of art and examines the plot, characterization, dialogue, and style to show how these elements contribute to work the theme or unity of the literary work. So, if all the elements works together in a literary work, it produces formal unity. Paradox, irony, dynamic tension, and unity are the primary values of the formalist criticism. Thus, the primary values of formalistic approach, as what I have been have been stated here, is the use of paradox, irony, tension, and unity. In formalistic approach, the intention fallacy is not included. What do we mean by intention fallacy? This states that an author's intention or purpose for creating the work is irrelevant in analyzing or evaluating that work. So, the meaning and value of a work reside in the text itself, independent of the author. So basically, in analyzing the text using this approach, the author's purpose on writing the work was the least focus of the critics. Next, the affected fallacy, meaning this states that the evaluation of a work of art cannot be based solely on its emotional effects on the audience. Instead, criticism must concentrate upon the qualities of the work itself that produce such effects. So moreover, in critiquing literature using formalistic approach, the critic should not based on the emotional aspects of the work. Rather, formalistic approach focuses on the qualities of the text itself. So it deals with the form of the literature and finding some patterns or the words used by the author in literature. So the critic can also analyze the author's use of figurative language. Remember, we are dealing with the forms used in the literary work. So it is essential for the critic to examine what are the figurative language, the words used, the patterns used, or other literary devices used by the author in writing the text. Next approach is the psychological approach. So the psychological approach has been one of the most productive forms of literary inquiry in the 20th century. So this approach became one of the most controversial literary criticism approach in the 20th century. It was developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s by Sigmund Freud and his followers. So psychological criticism has led to new ideas about the nature of the creative process, the mind of the artist, and the motivation of its character. So Sigmund Freud became the most renowned who provided the foundation for this approach, which is the psychological approach. He provided new ways of looking on how we look at ourselves in literature. So this approach has led to new ideas about the nature of human psyche, including the mind of the artist as well as the characters used in the story. So Freud's principal ideas are essential to an understanding of modern literature and criticism. So in psychological approach, we have four main ideas that have been influential across the time. First is the Freud's theory about the unconscious. So according to Freud, human beings are not conscious of all their feelings, urges, and desires because most of the mental life is unconscious. So according to him, human mind entails a small conscious portion and the vast unconscious portion. So he argued that humans are not conscious of their feelings and desires. Next, the idea of repression. So observing the conservative British upper middle classes of the late 19th century, Freud came to the conclusion that society demands restraint, order, and respectability, and that individuals are forced to repress the libidinous and aggressive drives. So the idea of repression, according to Freud, that one's libidos and aggressive drives may not be represented directly. These repressed desires emerge in dreams and in art. So that's why this leads to the use of symbols and subtext in dreams and literature. That's why in some of the literature we often look for the symbols used in the literature. It can be expressed by creating beautiful or terrifying images and narratives. Next is Freud's tripartite psyche. So in here, we know this symbolically as the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. This was known as Freud's psychoanalytic theory and divided in the human psyche into three, which is the id, ego, and the superego. So when we say id, the unconscious, it is unconscious and includes the basic drives of the human mind, such as hunger, thirst, pleasure, and aggression. So the id, or the first part of the human psyche, is the id. It deals with the instant gratification. So Freud called this part as the pleasure principle. Next is the ego. Ego is the conscious part. It is the part of the mind that interacts with the external environment and with the other people in social situations. So in this time, the ego is reasonable, sane, and mature in nature. Lastly, the superego. So superego is considered as largely unconscious. It may seem that to look like our conscience rather, it is the thought to represent the idealized image in which our ego strives. Next is the Oedipus complex. In Greek mythology, Oedipus was king of Thebes, who, having been abandoned in childhood and consequently ignorant of his own identity, unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. So in here, in Freudian theory, he argues boys during phallic period. So the Oedipus complex focuses on the phallic period, which is the children who were 2 to 6 years old, who develops unconscious sexual desires or attractions to their mothers and treat their fathers as their corresponding rivalry. So Freud's theory became controversial because of his a lot of ideas about the human psyche, about the unconscious and the Oedipus complex. He became controversial, but then it provides the general foundation for psychoanalytic criticism. So in psychoanalytic criticism, Freud's considered as one of the most renowned founders of psychoanalytic criticism. He plays a vital role for the ideas that developed across the time. So the next approach is the philosophical approach. In here, there are two levels that concerns the philosophical approach. First, the first level involves the evaluation of a work and its ethical content. Philosophical criticism always assumes the seriousness of a work as a statement of values about life. So the philosophical critic judges a work on the basis of his or her articulated philosophy of life. So critics believed in using this approach that literature has good and negative effects on people. Critics often look for the author's unethical writings. So the second level of the philosophical approach deals with how a work reflects the human experience in the world and in the universe. So in short, the literature answers the questions: who are we? What are we searching for as we live our lives? How are we impacted by good and evil? These questions are fundamental in using philosophical approach in writing your literary analysis paper or when critiquing a work. Next is the sociological approach. So sociological criticism focuses on the relationship between literature and society. So basically, a critic using this approach looks on the relationship between the literature and the society. Next, literature is always produced in a social context. Writers may affirm or criticize the values of the society in which they live, but they write for an audience, and that audience is what we call the society. So the critic looks for the literature's social function. So what is the role of literature in dealing with these societal events or dealing with societal issues, or what really happens in the society? Lastly, like the moral critic, the sociological critic usually has certain values by which he or she judges literary works. So they are interested not only in the stated themes of literature, but also in the undiscovered themes, or what are the social issues that can reveal the relationship between literature, the readers, and where the readers belong to, which is the society. Next is the Marxist criticism. So to understand the sociological approach, sociological approach is related to Marxist criticism. A student or a critic must understand some of the principles related to the studies of Karl Marx, one of the most important theorists of the relationship between society, politics, and economics. So, comes from the name itself, Karl Marx founded the Marxist approach that focuses on the relationship between society, politics, and economics. Thus, Marx was an advocate for common man. When Marxist theory is applied, it looks at how the role of the common man or woman is presented and the struggles they face. So, this approach looks for the common man or woman's struggles in the society. And then Marx believed that history was the story of class struggles, and that the goal of history was classless society in which all people would share the wealth equally. So, the critic using this approach look for the exploitation of the working classes, or what we call the proletariat, by the capitalist classes who owned resources and national economics. So basically, Marx's approach in criticism looks for the relationship between societal classes and how this affect these types of social classes. Next is the gender or the feminist approach. So this approach is a subcategory of the sociological approach. So as what have been depicted on the name of this critical approach, it tackles the role and image of women in literature as a whole. It examines the role and image, so as what I have said earlier, it focuses on the image of women in general. So likewise, we can also apply an analysis of men and their stereotypical roles throughout the time, and how they interact with women, and how their image and roles are presented in the text. So consequently, we can also apply this notion to men. So this approach focuses on the relationship between the characters, either men or women, and their society. So oftentimes, the critic using this approach may also look for the societal issues that tackles about race, gender, and classes. Next is the archetypal approach. So the archetypal approach to literature evolved from studies in anthropology and psychology. So this approach to literature evolved from the studies in anthropology and psychology. So archetypal critics make the reasonable assumption that human beings all over the world have basic experiences in common and have developed similar stories and symbols to express these experiences. So the critics using this approach believe that human beings have basic experiences and stories in common that can be expressed through symbols. So their assumptions that myths from distant countries might help to explain a work of literature that might seem a little far-fetched. So one of these is through myths, the symbol through myths. It might seem a little far-fetched for the others, but archetypal critics believe that it is valid enough. So one of these critics is Carl Jung, one of the students of Sigmund Freud, who first used archetypes to depict the plots, the characters, and symbols that can be found in literature. First, here are some of the principal archetypes that are described commonly in literature. First is the hero and the quest. So according to Joseph Campbell, the story of the hero is the Monmouth, or the one story at the bottom of all stories. The hero is called to adventure. So basically, the representation of hero in literature is commonly called for adventure. So it is normal for the character, such as the heroes, to have a lot of adventure. The hero must go in a quest. Next, this means that the hero must go on a quest. The first stage of the quest is separation. So in this stage, the hero separates from familiar surroundings and goes on a journey. So the first stage of the hero that can be found in some of the literature, the first stage is what we call the separation. So in this stage, the hero goes on a journey and a lot of adventures. So the second stage of the quest is initiation. In here, the hero may fight a dragon, conquer an enemy, or in some other ways to prove his or her courage, wisdom gained in the initiatory phase. So the second stage is initiations. In here, the hero will conquer an enemy to prove his or her courage and wisdom along the way. Next archetypes is about, next pattern is the death and rebirth pattern. So many myths from around the world reflect the cycle of the seasons. Sometimes myths require a sacrifice so that the seasons can continue. So majority in the myths believed in the cycle of seasons and culture of sacrifice. So a sacrificial hero accepts death or disgrace so that the community can flourish. So in literature, a sacrificial hero, it may be a god or a king, accepts death so that the community or someone can live or flourish. So lastly, although the sacrifice is real, it is not necessarily to be regarded as final. For example, the god who dies in the winter may be reborn in the spring. So many myths represented these archetypes. So but then in the case of myths, the gods who dies in the winter may be reborn in the spring. So the symbols pattern can usually seen rather in literature, especially to myths when we deals with the gods and goddesses, right? Next, archetypes is the Mother Earth or the Father Sky. So a surprising number of cultures regard the Earth as the mother of all life, and she is sometimes seen as the original divinity who was wedded and superseded by the archetypal male divinity, which is the sky god. So the symbol of the Earth as the mother of all life, as one of the mythological archetypes who was expected to be wedded with the male divinity, which is the sky god. So the offspring of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father are all of the creatures that inhabit the world. The Earth Mother characters in literature are characterized by vitality, courage, and optimism. So the offspring of the Mother Earth and Father Sky are believed to be the creatures that inhabit the world. So the common characteristics of a mother in literatures can be characterized by vitality, courage, and optimism. So in here, the critics usually find or think of the mother and father characters in literature that can be considered as Mother Earth and as Father Sky. Next, the stock characters or the archetypal characters. Just as there are repeated archetypal patterns in literature, there are repeated types of stock characters. So these characters appear throughout the literature. So aside from having repeated archetypal patterns in literature such as the hero and the quest, death and rebirth, the Mother Earth and Father Sky, there are also repeated types of stock characters. So these characters can be easily recognized, in which they are the ones who represent on their most general form. For example, a hero, a villain, an innocent man or women, wise sage, Mother Earth or goddess, a clown, a fool, doll, devil, temptress, damsel in distress, knight in shining armor, goddess, and the like. So last critical approach that will be discussed for the first session of our discussion about interpreting and evaluating fiction is the reader response criticism. So reader response criticism is defined as based on its name, focuses its attention on the reader rather than the work itself. So this type of approach focuses primarily on the reader rather than the text. Next, reader response critics do not assume that a literary work is a finished product of two or with fixed formal properties rather, as for example formalist critics do. Instead, the literary work is seen as an evolving creation of the readers as he or she reads actively. So in writing a reader's response paper, critics do not focus on the formal elements of a literary work like formalist critics do. That usually formalist critics looks for the essential elements that the literature must have. But in here, we will focus on the reader. The main focus is the reader's response upon reading the literary piece actively. So in reader response criticism, the text itself has no meaning until it is read by a reader. The reader creates the meaning. So when the reader creates the meaning of the text, it mainly calls the attention on how we read the work. This approach can help the reader to understand how the text and their insights or experiences affects how they form their response to the text. So technically or basically, reader's response criticism focuses on the reactions of the reader upon reading the text. So that's the end of our first discussion about interpreting and evaluating fiction. So our next topic for our second session is about the types of fiction that tackles about short stories and novels. So that's all. Thank you. See you on our next discussion.